welcome Mayor Lisa Helps, who will lead the discussion with David Miller, former Mayor of Toronto and Managing Director of International Diplomacy at C40 Cities, and Susan Aitken, who is joining us virtually all the way from Scotland, where she is lead councillor and Mayor of Glasgow and host of COP26. Welcome to the stage, Mayor Helps.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Susan, hello. So nice to see you.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks very much for joining us. I'll just do a brief introduction and then we're going to dive right into to some questions and discussion. And then also we want to make sure that there is time for all of you to ask our distinguished guests here anything that you'd like to. So I would also like to begin with an acknowledgement that we're on the homelands of the Lekwungen speaking people, and to thank Carmen, who I believe has gone off back to her day now, for a very warm and thoughtful welcome. As Emily said, we've just come out of COP and we were just so lucky. Susan and I have been on a number of panels over the years and just so delighted that she said yes to joining us here today. So we're going to go to COP, to Ground Zero, to Glasgow, and hear a little bit from Susan about what it was like to host the world. And then David Miller works with C40 Cities, and he'll tell you a little bit about that. He was also at COP. And so we've got some really good discussion this morning about what it means for all of us. And Susan, you can't see the room here, but we are in downtown Victoria, at a hotel just near the water, and you've got local mayors and councillors, business leaders and others from our region gathered here today in an in-person event, which we're very happy about to learn from you. So thank you again for taking the time to join us. So we're actually going to start with Susan, and our question to you is, what was it like to host the world at COP? Maybe you could just share a little bit about your experience, and then what were the highlights for you as the Mayor of Glasgow?
Well, thanks very much for asking me to be here, Lisa. It's a pleasure to see you again, and David, who I saw only last week, but it's always a pleasure to see. What was it like to host COP? It was a wild ride, a slightly longer and bumpier ride than we had anticipated to get there, but incredible in the end. I think for the city, it exceeded our expectations. It was very exciting, very nerve-wracking. Glasgow has hosted big events before. We're one of the UK's premier event city, but never something on this scale. This is the biggest global event that we've hosted. And I think crucially, not a tourism or an entertainment or a sports event, which is by and large the kind of space that we've been in before, things like the Commonwealth Games, for example. I think from the point of view of the city, I'm not sure it could have gone better. The feedback that we got from delegates was overwhelmingly positive. They seem to have had a really good experience. The work that we put in as host city, and we had two big focuses in our themes, one of which was climate justice and social justice and the just transition, and the other was cities and municipalities and the role of local government. I think both of those came through very strongly, but probably the latter, particularly our city chambers, our equivalent of the city hall, we established as our host city zone and as the platform for cities and for municipalities to make their voice heard as the delivery agents for climate action. And I think that was an enormous success. And you're asking what were the highlights. It's difficult to pick out just one or two. I think moderating a session with John Kerry, for example, was something that was really exciting. But perhaps actually a couple of things in the second week when senior UN officials reached out to some of the city leaders who were there and said, well, without giving too much away, the Secretary General of the UN was basically saying, right, regardless of what comes out of this agreement by national governments, it's clear that cities are the good news story coming out of this COP. Cities have established themselves in leadership. You have made your voices heard. You have made a unified voice heard. And we hear it at the UN, and we recognise that this is actually something we need to tap into to put that cities are not just allies of the UN in this, but possibly our biggest allies, that we're the bulwark for climate action and for delivery on this agenda, and the bulwark that will hold national governments to account. So I think hearing how strongly that message had got through and had resonated at the highest levels of the UN, that was, it felt as though that was an achievement, and it was something that the city wanted, that we had wanted to get out of COP26, and it felt that that was something tangible and concrete, that collectively local governments of the world were really making that progress and establishing themselves, and that the platform that we had wanted to establish had been used effectively, very effectively, I think.
Congratulations, Susan. That's really great news. And I know that it always takes a collective effort, but thanks for your leadership in making the voices of cities heard at the UN. That's really wonderful. And thanks for sharing that highlight. David, you were there. Tell us a little bit about C40 Cities and what your takeaway was from COP for cities and what that means for us.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to thank South Island Prosperity Partnership for the invitation today and for the ongoing work. As perhaps the newest resident of Victoria here, it's an honor and a privilege to be here. And Councillor Aitken, it's great to see you again. I know you can't see us, but we can see you. I think my biggest takeaway is similar to Susan's. And there was a Time magazine headline during COP that summed it up very well from my perspective. And that headline was, "Nations bring pledges to Glasgow, cities bring actions." And to me, that was a very clear distinguishing point, and an important one for our work here in CIP, but also for the work globally on behalf of cities. C40 Cities is an organization originally of 40, hence the name, but now of nearly 100 of the world's major cities of over 3 million in population. And it's an organization of the mayors of those cities who've committed to using their voices and their actions to help the world avoid dangerous climate change. And essentially the way it works is that the mayors make a commitment in a declaration. Might be to clean energy, low carbon buildings, low carbon transportation. There's declarations around food. And then C40 works to assist the cities in collaborating through knowledge sharing with the support of our funders to help advance that action rapidly. Glasgow isn't a member, but it's a very close friend. It's a signatory to several of our declarations, particularly those around social justice, inclusion, and transitioning economies. Glasgow's gone through a post-industrial transformation. I hope Councillor Aitken gets to speak about it. That's a real model for how we might deal with adapting economies to climate. And the lessons for me at COP were really two. The intergovernmental process is complicated because of a requirement of unanimity. So in every COP, you have to get Saudi Arabia, Russia, Australia, and other difficult countries. A few years ago, Canada was actually a difficult country on that list, to agree to bold climate action, which means by definition, the world is always going to be struggling to agree to what's needed, because you have countries, it's not in their interest to agree, and because of the unanimity requirements, it slows things down. The contrast to that is the fact that local governments have to act. We see the impact of climate. You're seeing it severely in British Columbia. It's really shocking and shocking on the global stage what's happened over the past 6 months in this province. And as mayors and councillors and local businesses, we don't have time to wait 26 years to discuss and agree. We need to find a path forward that works for people. There's a low carbon future, and that works economically. And I found the commitments and actions of mayors who came to COP to be really inspiring. In general terms, they spoke at Glasgow City Hall, but Mayor Eric Garcetti, who's our chair, actually spoke on the main stage with the prime ministers and the presidents. And there were incredible examples of action. And at least I just cite a couple. Los Angeles runs its own electricity grid. When Mayor Garcetti first got elected, something like 34% was coal. By 2030, it'll be 97% clean. BC, that's obviously less of an issue. We have a clean grid, but the fact that a city could make that change is quite remarkable. Bogota, Colombia is building its first subway ever in the middle of the post-COVID economic recovery. It's using public transit and a dramatic change to electrify its bus system to power the recovery. And Turku, Finland, who I must confess I hadn't been to and didn't really know before, the mayor spoke at Glasgow City Hall, and she said not only are they going to be carbon neutral by 2029, their goal as a geographic place, not just the city operations, is to create an economy in which they're actually carbon positive. And to me, if we take these really interesting and inspiring examples and localize them and take the best practices, it gives us collectively a roadmap for what's possible in a way that ensures that nobody's left behind. It's not just about the carbon, it's about the jobs and the economy. I've probably been a bit longer than you wanted, but that's what I took from COP.
That's because you're a big city mayor who now lives in our region, so you can speak as long as you want. I think I forgot to mention, in case people don't know, David is the former mayor of Toronto, and he is now a resident of Fairfield, right here in Victoria. Do we still have Susan with us? Just want to make sure she's here before I ask the next question, because it's to both of them. Susan, can you hear us?
We've certainly got her name.
We've got her name. She's muted. Susan, you're muted. Do we have some tech support here to make sure we get her back?
Just while you're getting the tech, it was quite interesting, the buzz at COP, because, you know, Councillor Aitken said she was really delighted to chair a panel that John Kerry was a member. People like John Kerry were talking about cities. So we have a moment where people understand it's the local that matters. And I think that's really important, really important, and gives us real potential to put local ideas into meaningful action.
Maybe I'll go on to the next question, and then I'll repeat it for Susan, because it's really for both of you and for all of us to think about and to discuss. And we didn't orchestrate this, but the Time magazine article that David referenced, I've got a quote from it from one of his colleagues, Mark Watts, who's the director of C40 Leadership. And what Mark said in this Times article was the single fastest way that national governments, there she is. Susan, were you, that's okay. Were you hearing all of that?
No, I'm sorry. I completely lost my connection there for a minute. My apologies.
No problem. Okay, perfect time to come back. Thanks for joining us. I'm just going to read from that the Times magazine article that David cited. And this is a question for both of you about resources. And so Mark Watts said the single fastest way that national governments can make good on the promises they've made here at COP in the next few years is to devolve more power to city governments. And so maybe both of you could talk not just about power, but about resources. What is needed to help the national governments deliver on their new commitments at the city level? What more power, what more authority? And Susan, why don't we start with you? And maybe if you can give some examples of what works and what might not work in the UK, and what you'd like to see and what it means for cities.
So, I mean, I think something to understand about UK cities is that by and large, we don't have the same kind of powers that cities in North America and Europe do. We tend to be quite constrained in how we raise revenue, for example, indeed our ability to raise revenue at all at local level. So local taxation is very limited. Most of our resource comes from the national level. So there's a challenge right away, and it's a challenge for all cities, but I think particularly acute in the UK. National governments need to trust cities more, trust their choices around the raising of revenue, around investments, around, I suppose, just kind of how urban systems are funded and structured in the future, and recognise that that has to be a decision for cities to make. I think there's recognition that net zero will be reached and our new green economy will be made in places ultimately, and places where people live. And it is local governments who know those places and people better than anyone else and are best placed to make those choices. And we've seen as well, of course, that in a number of countries, and I spoke to mayors from places like Brazil, for example, at COP26, where local leaderships are, as was the case in the United States, for a 5-year term there. It's local leaderships who are not only leading the way and setting the agenda, but standing up against a very regressive agenda at the nation state level, and who are it's local leaderships who are the hope for the future for those places and people that they represent very often. So those local leaderships have more of a challenge, but where local and national are aligned, as is largely the case in the UK, then governments really have to be putting their money where their mouth is, and recognising that what matters most now is the pace and scale of delivery and the effectiveness of delivery, and it is cities that are best placed to do that. So it's a combination of power and resource and trust, and that just that acknowledgement that this is we don't have time on this to be kind of working out how, going through the processes of national politics and national governments, which are often that good bit slower. That this is an emergency, so let's act like it's an emergency and put the powers where they are going to be most effective and deliver most quickly, and that will be almost always at the most local level and in cities where the biggest challenges, but it's also the opportunities for the biggest gains in terms of decarbonisation if investment is directed in the right place.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up on what you said and pose the same question to David, but adding in the element of trust. So do we have everything we need as cities in terms of power and resources to deliver on these actions? And if not, in Canada specifically, and in our regions even more specifically, how do we build that trust with senior levels of government to get the power and resources we need to deliver what ultimately will help them go to COP27 and say we're doing better?
Well, I think, first of all, you need a partnership with other governments. The minister was here. She clearly understands local government. There's a moment in British Columbia right now where we really can build that partnership. When I was still in office in Toronto, what we talked about was money, power, and respect. And respect to us meant a seat at the table as an equal. Because we have different jurisdiction, but we're not subordinate except in a technical legal sense. We have very democratic obligation and right to act. And I think when you take those principles about money, power, and respect and apply them to climate, you come to a position that's very like what Councillor Aitken just articulated. Local governments are in a unique position to understand how to both build a consensus and how to take a leadership position in making the change necessary to decarbonize our society, and do it in a way that's understanding of people's needs, that ensures social justice, and collaborates with the business community to make it possible to prosper. And for me, the system works best when we see that local leadership occurring. Yes, we may not have all the money and all the power to execute the plan, but the plan has to come from the local level. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And I think if Councillor Aitken gets a chance to speak about it, she can talk to Glasgow's plan, which is incredibly impressive. And we see lots of examples of this globally, of cities and towns taking leadership, the mayors being in a position to use their bully pulpit, and coming from that position of strength and coherence means that you can build a meaningful partnership with the province and the federal government to get the money where you need it. If you don't have the plan, you're not going to get the money because you're just applying for a few grants, and you'll get the smallest ones because that's how it works. And just to give a few examples on this, Toronto, for example, doesn't have legal authority over its building code. But because buildings are such a huge relative source of carbon emissions, depends where you are, but they're certainly well over 20%. Sometimes in New York City, their emissions, about 70% are buildings. Because it was so important in Toronto, they used their planning powers to ensure that taller buildings, when they were constructed, were built to the best low carbon standards. They need to do better now, but they were able to be really, really creative. We've seen multiple cities build transit plans, for example, without the funding, but it allows them to have the conversation with government in order to get the funding. The same with leadership on active transportation as you've taken here in Victoria, Mayor. It's such, I rode my bike today. One time I rode it on
Very
the bike
good.
lanes. And when I went off the bike lane, a police officer stopped me and said, "You're interfering with traffic," but that's a separate story. To me, that taking that kind of leadership with a clear plan, clear action, particularly around buildings in transportation, gives the possibility of speaking to the province and Ottawa as an equal and getting the funding and the powers needed to do it properly.
That is a really great point. So make the plan and build the relationship and then ask for the money once you've got something, rather than just saying we don't have enough power and we don't have enough resources. That's really helpful. Susan, I want to come back to you in the moment where you were kind of blanked out a little bit. David mentioned Glasgow's post-industrial transformation and some of what you've been through. And now he just mentioned your climate plan. So we're here together at Rising Economy Week. This is about our regions rebuilding our economy coming out of COVID and in preparation for low carbon prosperity. So maybe you could just give us a few examples and inspirations from Glasgow about that post-industrial transformation, some of what you've been able to accomplish, and then any highlights of your climate plan in terms of building inclusive low carbon prosperity over the next years and decades.
Yeah, so Glasgow still lives with the legacies of deindustrialisation. Kind of 40 years ago, broadly, 40, 50 years ago, during the 1970s and 80s, really, and it was rapid. And I heard someone say the other day that it was unjust because it was unplanned. I would argue it was planned to be unjust, and that that a city like Glasgow was seen as not worth the time or the investment at the time. But it's left us with social, economic and physical legacies. And I suppose what we are trying to do in using the opportunity of addressing the climate emergency and the opportunity of a new transition is use the physical interventions that we are going to have to make to decarbonise, to also address those social and economic legacies as much as we can. So David's already touched on the big areas are buildings and transport. And so we've done a feasibility study on the retrofitting of what would be around 430,000 dwellings, domestic dwellings across our city region. And I think what's amazing about it is the cost benefit analysis that has come back in that feasibility study. The independent analysts who did that were saying, we've never really seen anything like this before. You know, they're looking at, you know, for every pound that we invest in that retrofitting, you're looking at something like £6 returned in benefits, in improved health, because people are just have better conditions in their homes, in addressing fuel poverty, which is one of the biggest social justice issues in a cold and rainy country like Scotland for kind of 8 months of the year at least, and where it gets dark by 3:30 in the afternoon at this time of year. My apologies about that dog. You know, so those kinds of issues, the return that we get on that investment is fantastic. And of course, the job creation as part of that as well is also really, really striking. So it's understanding how we and the phrase that one of my colleagues used is this: it's not a cost. It's how do we cash flow this transition, because what we get at the other end is so worth it. It's so worth the effort. And it's the same with the kinds of things that David was talking about there, transforming mobility and connectivity through new low carbon transport systems, or through active investment in active travel as well. Again, you're not just investing in people getting from A to B, you're investing in people being connected to economic opportunities, to leisure opportunities, to cleaner air, to people just moving around in a more healthy way. And all of those things bring you concrete, tangible benefits and improvements in the cost of living and living conditions and life opportunities for your citizens. And in Glasgow, we have citizens who have lived with, frankly, stunted life opportunities for generations now, for 40 years. And lots of the things that we've tried haven't made the difference that they need to make. So we need something ambitious. We need a big bang approach. The climate emergency requires that. It requires us to act like it's an emergency. So, you know, let's not be scared of the kinds of scale of investment that we're talking about. In Glasgow, our initial estimates are £30 billion to make that decarbonisation shift over the next decade. Buildings, transportation, the transformation of our public realm, the either removal or covering up of the urban highways that were built through the city in the 1960s and 70s, and the creation of more green space and the creation of green jobs as well, and locations for those green jobs. All of those things working together, we think, can be genuinely transformational, and it will help us deliver that just transition with the focus on people who were previously left behind. So that's what we're all about. The plan is there. It is challenging, and we know we can't deliver it on our own. It needs to be on the basis of those partnerships that David was talking about, partnerships with our two national governments in Scotland, our devolved Scottish government and our supranational UK government, but also with the private sector as well, with global investors, with you know, the pension funds out there, for example, who are actively looking to shift their investment streams towards low carbon and zero carbon. You know, had we not been COP26 host city, I don't think we would be in this position where we are. But because we were, it accelerated our ability to have those conversations and say, Glasgow can give you that investment. Glasgow can give you that opportunity to direct your investment and hopefully also share the benefits of that with other cities.
Susan, thanks so much. That's really interesting. A number of my colleagues in the region today, Capital Regional District, which is our regional government directors and mayors, we are working on a very similar home retrofit program. We're just going through our budgeting right now. We're looking for an additional $1 million requisition from our residents to get the program off the ground. So I think there's probably great interest in this room to learn about your program, and let's learn together. And then what you just said about the cost of the transition, how much is it going to cost? And flipping it on its head, as you said, and asking how do we cash flow the transition? So it's a cash flow issue, not a cost issue. So David, can you talk a little bit about that, and any insights you have for our colleagues here in terms of how we finance the transition? How do we cash flow that transition? Yeah, in anything that you've heard globally that would apply here.
It's a great question, and it gets to the heart of what we need to do. I think the first principle, for me at least, is most investments, public or private, that are going to decarbonize have an upfront cost, but a lower operating cost. So, for example, Bloomberg Philanthropies did a study with C40 a few years ago about electric buses, and it showed very clearly that in a busy transit system, it showed very clearly that even though an electric bus is more expensive to purchase than a diesel bus, the overall life cycle costs will be the same or less because of the decreased operating costs. And you heard Councillor Aitken speak to that about fuel poverty. You know, doing these energy retrofits is sort of obvious, but it makes the buildings much cheaper to run when it's done properly. And so the art is in connecting somehow the upfront cost with the financial stream that has lower expenses. And in government-owned housing, for example, that's relatively easy to do, and we have an infinite time horizon compared to the private sector. It's more complicated to do in private residences or in private transportation. The good news is there is a huge amount of capital waiting to be deployed on climate solutions right now. The second part of the good news is that capital is having trouble getting real returns on other medium to longer term investments because we're in a low interest rate environment. The not so good news is that they need scale in order to invest, whether it's in clean energy, in energy retrofits, in transportation. And I think that's something that this partnership could think about. How do we create scale for projects like energy retrofits, perhaps for transformational transportation projects and others? How do we create scale that each of us, even the great district of Saanich, might not be large enough on its own to have the scale necessary? How do we use this partnership? And what's the role of businesses and private landowners in working with local government to help create a partnership that can create the scale to access that financing that's there and is desperately looking for a place to invest?
Thanks, David. That's a really great point. And one of the other things that is being worked on in this region, City of Victoria has partnered with, and this is a plug for our director on the Green Municipal Fund, with the Mars Discovery District in Toronto and the City of Barrie to create a municipal impact investment fund nationally to batch all of our investments in the region and some pilots in Ontario, pilots in BC. What are the retrofit projects? And then that investment is waiting. So anyone who's interested, I mentioned it at the CRD board table, but that's a real possibility that could scale up quite quickly if the Green Municipal Fund funds the application that has been made for this project. Now it's over to all of you. Questions that you have for Susan or David about COP, about cities, about what we do next, about what's required in our region. Yes. So just hold on one second. Can someone give her a microphone so that I was going to try and repeat the question, but it might be too long and I want Susan to be able to hear it as well.
Oh, thank you. Hi. So Nikki McDonald, you've been talking about the role of cities and the important role that cities can play in terms of knowing their local needs and being able to empower local efforts. But one of the great transformations that we have to do is changing our energy systems. And that's going to require national and transborder in our North American case. So how do you see cities working? How do you see them contributing to that and still maintaining some agility to be able to respond to their local opportunities?
Well, from my perspective, grids are controlled differently globally. So in some places in the United States, they're controlled locally. Toronto owns Toronto Hydro, which owns the grid, but doesn't own generation capacity, maybe a little bit, but in general not. BC, it's different. Quebec, it's different. But notwithstanding that, C40 mayors have signed an energy declaration that commits them to decarbonizing their energy systems. And they're able to do it because even in a place where the power is controlled centrally, there is significant local impact. For example, district energy systems, highly, highly efficient. Can you create, when there's a new development, district energy systems that are decarbonized? Can you use your purchasing power? It's less relevant in British Columbia, but in a lot of places like in Australia, in which, if those of you who follow the news about climate politics, Australia has bitterly fought any efforts to decarbonize because the coal industry is so influential there, and the current government is a great supporter of coal, which is kind of depressing and shocking, but that's a separate point. But the Mayor of Melbourne has led a local purchasing initiative that has essentially decarbonized their grid by using local purchasing powers. So she has created a partnership with the hospitals and the universities and other big power users, and they've committed to entirely buying clean energy. And private suppliers are building huge solar arrays outside of Melbourne. So there are ideas globally, and I would take those beyond energy as well. How can we use our purchasing power to transform, I don't know, the courier industry? Why isn't it using electric vans? Is there a way we can use our purchasing power to address that collectively? But those are certainly some of the ways that cities and towns have addressed energy generation, even when they don't have the legal jurisdiction over it.
Thank you. Susan, did you want to add anything to that?
I think David's nailed it, but the other thing to remember is there's no one single technological solution, and a lot of those will be local as well. So in Scotland, for example, almost all of our electricity now is green electricity from wind power. A combination of onshore and offshore wind power, but most of us still heat our homes with gas, North Sea gas, which obviously it is a fossil fuel. But there isn't going to be enough electricity for everyone. The grid, electricity grid isn't going to be able to support all of us simultaneously shifting to electric heating as well. So we need other sources as well as wind. So in Glasgow, for example, we believe that our river, and we're doing some work on this just now, could be a massive source of heat for possibly around 50% of the homes in the city. Others who are a bit further away from the river, it'll be a combination of things like ground source and air source and green hydrogen, which Scotland has a big potential for as well. So there's going to be a mix of technologies in there in order to build resilience into the energy system as well. There's not the homes aren't going to be overly reliant on one source, which is potentially not going to be able to support everyone. So again, there is where the opportunity for local leadership and local input on the things, and district heating, I think David is absolutely bang on in that, where we are leading on planning, on commissioning new housing. In Glasgow, we are building a huge amount of new social rented housing over the coming years, more than we have in decades. We need to make sure that not only is that built as green housing, as energy efficient housing, but also that it is on shared heat networks, which, as David said, gives us enormous opportunity there for efficiency and for tackling fuel poverty, as well as the shift to away from fossil fuel sources to green sources.
I like Susan's answer better than mine, so take hers home with you.
I think they were both good answers. Just to add something quickly on procurement before we go to the next question. Here in British Columbia, we have what's called the BC Social Procurement Initiative, which is helping local governments drive their purchasing decisions to make some of these transitions. And so I'm just going to ask Christy Mader to give a wave. She is with Scale, and they run the BC Social Procurement Initiative. In our region, City of Victoria, Esquimalt, Souk, and the CRD are members. That means there are a lot who aren't. So if you're interested in joining, you can talk to, this was not meant to be an ad for BCSBI, but it's turning into one because it was a really good question. Our purchasing power as local governments and other public sector institutions is very powerful and can help drive that transition. And we have a government funded program in BC that is helping to do just that. Other questions? Yes. Doug, and if someone could bring the lovely councillor a microphone.
Oh, okay.
COVID rules, she's holding your mic. Okay, go ahead, councillor.
Thank you very much. Just a quick question. So the last part of your question is, where do we start? So it's an interesting question because if you look at our GHGs right now in Greater Victoria, what's the #1 cause? Transportation, right? And we keep on picking on buildings and homes and things like this. And I looked at the number, and I think the bigger impact is how do we get vehicles off the road? So carrot or stick, I just think we're not tackling the bigger problem that we have. And lately trying to get into town in the mornings, even with the Mackenzie Exchange up and running, it's just as bad now. It's back to where it used to be. So it's just, I don't know. It's people's attitudes, right? I think it comes down to that. It's if you look at it, and I'm just as guilty as anyone else. I'm sitting there driving my car all by myself. Well, I can at least say this morning, acknowledge we came in 3 of us in one car, but it was, or I can get on a bicycle. I don't have an electric one yet, but so it's It's how do we change the attitude of people? We're not tackling that side of it right now. And because it's always someone else, it's someone else's problem. You talk to your neighbors, right? Oh, that someone else is going to do that. Even if we had LRT that went out to the West Shore, for example, how many people would use it? I don't know. You know, my neighbor will do it. It's never me because it's not convenient. So it's just a generic question, you know, how do we change that? Do you have any ideas? How do we change people's mindsets? Thank you.
That is a brilliant $1 million question. It's a good one. So Susan, I'm going to go to you first and then to David. How do we change people's minds and how is this also something for them?
So I don't think we can pretend that there's any easy answers to this. And I'm certainly not going to pretend that I've got the answers. On transport, we have had the experience of COVID has been really interesting actually, and the response to that. So as Scotland started to open up from the last summer, from our first lockdown, we then went on to have another lockdown after that. There was a need for, I suppose, giving people a bit of confidence that they could safely go back out and live in the world again. And the Scottish Government responded to that by using their COVID emergency regulations to allow local authorities like Glasgow to very quickly make changes to the allocation of road space, and to do things like pop-up bicycle lanes and overnight pedestrianisation of streets. Ordinarily, that could take us 18 months to 2 years to go through all of the regulatory processes that would be involved in that. Now, there's a real risk in that, but I suppose we had the public health excuse, justification almost, to do something that we had aspirations to do anyway, but which we knew would be challenging. So we called it our Spaces for People programme, and said, you know, first and foremost, this is about literally creating space for people to feel confident that they can move around the city safely, and with that, that they're not going to be crowded into spaces that would otherwise ordinarily be taken up by cars. But we very quickly have repurposed a lot of road space that previously was used either for parking or for cars. And what it's allowed us to do, I suppose, is have people experience it in real time. So had we consulted on that as a hypothetical and we'd gone out to people and said, how would you feel if we took away 40% of the on-street parking in Glasgow city centre and replaced it with space for bars and restaurants, to have outdoor dining? How would you feel if we overnight took cars off of a couple of quite commonly used connection routes? How would you feel if we took this 4-lane road down to 2 lanes of traffic and created bike lanes? We probably wouldn't have got a positive response to that consultation. But when we asked them afterwards, how do you feel about all that stuff that we did as a public health response to the COVID crisis? Do you want us to keep it? Lo and behold, they did want us to keep it. And it's been brilliant actually, and I think it's allowed me to go, right, okay, while we're still in this space and we've still got people experiencing that, let's use that opportunity. And it is straight up opportunism. I'm not, you know, there isn't another way to describe it. So there's carrot and stick in there together. The stick is that you just make it more difficult for them to park in the city centre. We have done that by stealth, really. The carrot is that it's a much more enjoyable experience, that they can see actually that getting on the bike feels safer, feels like something that's an enjoyable thing to do, that you can do with your family, in confidence that you can do it safely, or going for a walk, or just having that space suddenly feels transformative. The other stick, which I don't have, and I think for some of that really big scale transformation, and it goes back to the point I was making earlier about UK cities being constrained in what we can do locally, but London were able to do it, is something like a congestion charge, which has worked now very successfully for 20 years in London. And if you had said to people, well, they did say back at the time, this will never work. People will hate it. They'll be absolutely against it. But it's been an enormous success in London, and it has raised revenue that has then been directly reinvested into public transportation, and people have been able to see the direct connection between that stick of saying, fine, you can drive in central London, but you will have to pay a price for doing so. And then the benefits in investment in particularly in buses in London, which have been very noticeable. I don't have that power in Glasgow. I would very much like to have that power, which is not to say that I would definitely do it. I think it's something, it's big. I think you would need a democratic mandate to do that. It would need to be in an election manifesto. It's not something you could just impose on people from left field, but something like that, again, gives you that combination of carrot and stick in a single action, if you like. And that's the kind of thing that, again, if we're serious about treating this as an emergency, then that's the kind of thing that cities across the world should be able to implement in a way that suits their particular populations.
We're almost coming to the end of our time here, but David, I'd like you to answer the question as well. Maybe a little bit more, not just how do we change people's minds, but building on what Susan said, how do we bring people along?
So 3 things. First thing is you have to make it easy for people not to choose a car. Now, I live next door to the Fairfield bike shop. It's very easy for me to choose a bike. If you're in Langford, maybe it's less easy. And the studies all show that if you're in a city that has really good public transport, people who live close to it will use it predominantly. In Toronto's case, it's something like a 60% modal split, where people are no more than 1 bus away from a subway or a streetcar, and then it plummets. So make it easy. Second thing is, I think people need to see that there is a transformation to low carbon transportation that they can believe in. And to me, the way you do that is through a combination of active transport. So you've got a lot of people walking and cycling, and you're encouraging development in a way that allows people to live so they can walk or cycle to work, which might mean putting work near where people are living, not just putting people downtown. But you also need to really push on greening fleets, including private fleets, so people can see that there are clean vehicles, and it works, because there's this chicken and egg problem with people transitioning to clean cars. And the third thing is, so the first, if you can find ways to get people out of cars, transit's the best, but there are others. You can diminish car usership. The second is showing people that they can use electric vehicles and others by fleets. And the third is stick measures. You know, in the way that London has done this is quite brilliant, because they originally talked about addressing congestion, which is what the congestion charge did. It's a toll on going into central London. They used all of the money to improve public transit, but in the expansion of it, and Mayor Sadiq Khan has expanded it so it's 500 square miles, the current congestion zone. They only talked about health. And I completely coincidentally happened to be in London the day they were launching it. And I watched on the BBC, and the BBC interviewed a courier driver who said, I don't like this, I have to pay more. And then they interviewed, for the other side of the story, they interviewed a school, and they interviewed a deputy headmaster in a school who was standing beside a wall that had an entire rack of asthma inhalers, because the air quality was so bad in that inner part of London that reducing emissions from transport was the most important thing for kids' health, to avoid them getting asthma. And that's why Mayor Khan has been able to successfully change the narrative and implement this. Not saying air quality is the issue here. It's different. You know, we live near the ocean. It's beautiful. But there are public health kind of issues that you might be able to work on that would help change the narrative. So if you make it easy for people not to use a car, if you show them that it's realistic to use green transportation by starting with fleets, because they're the easiest to change, and if you change the narrative to talking about health and other issues, I think you've got a real chance to persuade a lot of people. And it doesn't have to be everybody. You just need a critical mass and you can really change what's happening.
Thank you, David. Those are perfect words to end on. Thanks to the folks who asked questions. For those who are in the room, there'll be a break and then a round table. And so if you are here and want to ask David a question, feel free. Susan is going to go on with the rest of her evening in Glasgow, so she will not be here to answer any more questions. So if we could thank her very much for joining us, thank David as well, and thank all of you.
Thank you. Bye.